Hello, everyone. My name is Ishel Rosal, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Student Life out of the Office of University Life. And I'm very glad to welcome you, both here and via live streaming, to today's event, Awakening Our Democracy, Feminism, Media, and the State of the Union. Awakening Our Democracy is Columbia's lunchtime conversation series focused on race, ethnicity, disparities, justice, and other pressing issues of our time, both here at the university as well as nationally and globally. The Office of University Life, which hosts this event, focuses on university as community. We work with students, faculty, and staff from across the university on student life, intellectual life, and community citizenship issues. You can learn more about our office and see the entire Awakening Our Democracy series on our website as well as our app. Today's theme is Feminism, Media, and the State of the Union, and we have a terrific panel lined up for you today to help us dig into this important conversation. And I will introduce them in just a moment. But first, for guidance for today's conversation, I'd like to share an excerpt from last week's op-ed by Professor Suzanne Goldberg, the Executive Vice President for University Life. She said, quote, "Whatever your views, whether you supported any or none of the candidates, this is a time to affirm our shared commitment to learning and discovery, to our diversity as a strength, and to inclusive community as a core Columbia value." Whether you were watching the debates or following Twitter or reading the morning headlines, the figurative State of the Union has been difficult to watch. And today, after the election, many questions remain. Next, I'd like to share a sampling of the questions many of you submitted to us for today's conversation, including, how can we better include all races and transgender women in conversations about feminism? Is there a Trump effect on the way we talk about gender issues, gender bias, and misogyny? And especially for our panelists, what have been your experiences breaking into your respective industries, and what support and inspiration did you find? And finally, do you have any tips for leading and navigating conversations about gender and bias that become aggressive and include personal attacks? We'll look forward to more of your questions later. Now I'd like to turn to our panel. Each has a fascinating career, and I'll mention just a few highlights here and encourage you to check the University Life website for more, including suggested readings submitted by our panelists today. Thank you all for submitting those suggestions. First, our moderator, Juju Chang. She is co-author of ABC News' Nightline and has covered breaking news, celebrity profiles, and practically everything in between in nearly 30 years of working in TV news. Recently, she was on the campaign trail following writer-actor Lena Dunham's work on this election. Next, we have Professor Helen Benedict, who teaches here at the Journalism School and is a novelist and writer focused on social injustice, war, women soldiers, military sexual assault, and Iraqi refugees. Her work led to the class action suit against the Pentagon and inspired the documentary, The Invisible War, which some of you may have watched for our Sexual Respect Initiative here at Columbia. She is also the author of Virgin or Vamp, How the Press Covers Sex Crimes. Next, we have Jamil Smith, who is a senior national correspondent for MTV News and previous columnist and podcast host for New Republic, where he focused on identity politics. He has also worked at MSNBC and CNN and has written for The Washington Post, Ebony, and The Griot. And next to him is Professor Premila Nadesan. She teaches history at Barnard College and focuses on social change, race, gender, social policy, and labor history. She has published extensively on multiple meanings of feminism and written about alternative labor movements and grassroots community organizing, welfare rights in the United States, and post-war domestic worker activism. And finally, Marianne Schnall. She founded Feminist.com in 1995 and serves as its executive director. She also writes frequently for many outlets, including Time.com and Marie Claire. Her latest book, What Will It Take to Make a Woman President?, conversations about women, leadership, and power. And with that, I turn it over to Juju. Thank you all.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I love the box lunches. It's an excellent look for you. I cannot think of a more timely and more aptly named and more efficiently and energetically and intellectually pitch-perfect panel as this one is today. We have a lot to dig into, and obviously you are an engaged audience. You are a well-informed audience. So we're going to go into a sort of masterclass on some of these issues, all through the rubric of feminism, because that is what these scholars and journalists and authors have been working on throughout their lives. And so we want to look at the election through the prism of feminism. But first, I want to break it down into a couple of different tranches so that we can all take bites at different buckets so we can know what to expect and know what to think going forward. One is, how did we get here? It's a Hillary defeat, a Clinton victory, but let's take a look at sort of the coalition, the tactics, how did we get here? Secondly, I want to look at sort of how did we miss this? Both the pollsters, the media, scholars. There were some assumptions and some signals that may have been missed. I want to get a little bit into that. Also, again, through the rubric of feminism. And third, what does this say about feminism now and the state of it now and moving forward? Awakening, as I say, is such an apt title for this series and for today's discussion, because I think that we are in the midst of an awakening. I want to see if you guys can point to some signs of it and where the direction of it might lead us. So let's start with you, Professor. Give us a sense of sort of how did we get here?
Wow. Well, like many of you, I'm still stunned and still not sure whether I'm awake or not, or having a terrible nightmare. So I can't promise I'm going to give you any very succinct answers at the moment, because I don't think any of us quite know yet. I'm a little reluctant to do a lot of finger pointing and blaming of each other, blaming feminists, blaming Bernie bros, blaming the media, blaming the non-voters. Everybody has some responsibility, but not one entity is at fault. I keep thinking back to 1980 when I was a young journalist, and I was actually doing an article on Robin Morgan, who's one of the founders of Ms. Magazine. And I happened to be with her the night that Reagan was elected. And I remember she turned to me and she said, "This is the end of feminism and the beginning of a long road downhill." And the backlash has been steady against feminism ever since. And I do think that rather than blaming feminism for its own failures, and of course it hasn't been perfect, we have to remember there's been a long, concerted push against feminism that's gone on and on and on, including characterizing it as elitist, as man-hating, as all-white, as extremist and fanatic, and nothing but man-hating lesbians. And I'm afraid that Megyn Kelly let me down yesterday. I heard her on the radio being interviewed about empowering women to fight back against sexual assault the way she had, and she said, "I'm not a feminist." So I think one of the things we've got to do is push forward and remind everyone that feminism is about equal rights for everybody, regardless of their origins, their religions, their races, whoever they are, equal rights and respect for everyone. And that is the main thing to push forward. And that is and we lost sight of a lot of that in some of the discussion around this election.
I'm curious if any of you see this as a defeat or referendum on feminism. I mean, 53% of white women in this country voted for Donald Trump, 53-43. And there's a lot to dig into there.
Well, I just think, looking at it politically speaking, we have to understand that white women typically vote Republican. We have to understand that they went for Romney, they went for McCain, and by slightly lesser margins this time for Trump. And so I think one problem we did, confront, I think, especially in the press, is assuming that because the candidate was such an out-and-out misogynist because he had made lewd and terrible comments bragging about committing sexual assault, that somehow the nation at large would share our disgust. And frankly, I think, either we did not a good enough job of convincing them, especially those of us in the opinion writing industry, or frankly, there are other factors at play that we just did not consider because, frankly, we're not thinking intersectionally. We're not thinking about how race, how religion, how local identities play into someone's vote.
Yeah, I think in some ways the election was a referendum on feminism. I think in some ways it was a referendum on race, given Trump's rhetoric around immigrants, his xenophobia, his racism, his anti-Semitism. And I think what we saw in the election is how most white women in this country voted for racial solidarity with other white people rather than in favor of feminism. I will also say that I'm a historian of feminism, and I use the term feminisms because there is more than one feminism. There are multiple strands, multiple definitions of feminism, and I think we need to keep that in mind. Hillary Clinton represented a particular brand of feminism, what I call a kind of corporate feminism that was interested in representational politics and how do I break the glass ceiling? How do we all break the glass ceiling? And it's a vision of feminism that's about incorporating women into the power structure as it exists. There are other forms of feminism that want to sort of explode the way we understand gender or think about ways in which we can provide for working class and poor women. But I think part of the reason we saw a failure of women to identify with Hillary in this election was because her brand of feminism didn't really resonate with a lot of women in this country.
What are the other brands of feminism that you think might have been perhaps more effective in this cycle?
Well, I think given that economic inequality is as great as it is greater than it's been in 100 years in this country, I think a certain kind of feminism that speaks to the question of economic injustice, about the ways, we hear in the media about populism and, the working class, which is often very male-defined as people understand it in their minds. Women are a huge part of the working class, and I think we have to look at women. In fact, 2/3 of low-wage workers are women workers, and so we have to begin to think about how do we speak to the very real issues that working class women are facing in terms of childcare, in terms of low wages, in terms of the cost of housing and things like that.
Well, I was just going to say, first, let me also preface by saying that I'm still in shock and I'm still processing it all. And I speak only for myself in the sense of, I think we all have different lenses into all this. And I'm still learning. I'm learning even on this panel. But to me, this was a backlash against feminism in terms of against multiculturalism and all of the direction that the country was headed, and I think we did take it for granted. I think the one thing that I think to myself, having had a book out, what will it take to make a woman president, is sort of regardless of what you think of Hillary and whether you supported Hillary, there was just no question that gender and sexism was a factor in this campaign and how she was treated. And I was just amazed. It wasn't more of a conversation, and I'm not quite sure why that was in terms of, while Trump, who could, this racist, sexist, sexual predator who wouldn't show his tax returns and everything else, and then Hillary, who was just like demonized for her emails and just all of the stuff around, that lock her up and all of this trust, and she doesn't smile, and all of the, when she said she doesn't have a presidential look. In the end of the campaign, where even Barack Obama was saying, challenging men to confront, do they have some kind of unconscious bias towards powerful, ambitious women? So I haven't unpacked it all yet, but I do think that gender did play a role in this outcome. But I also think, somebody who has founded a website on feminism, this was the direction feminism needed to go anyway, and it's being forced to now be more intersectional and to form these coalitions. So hopefully this was the wake-up call that we do need, so that it has to move in that direction.
Both Pramila and Jamil, I want you to think for a moment with me, because while I do think that there were racial divisions in the way that you look at the electorate, there were very much class lines as well, working class folks, especially if you look at the Rust Belt and what we called Reagan Democrats, the swing voters who were the Rust Belt working class. They voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, but it wasn't just a race issue because many of those counties went for President Obama in 2008 and 2012. So speak to some of that sort of working class anger.
Well, number one, I'm from that Rust Belt. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I understand a lot of that tension, that angst, that hopelessness. I've seen it in my communities when I, go home and I see the empty storefronts and I see the unemployed, folks, just trying to get by. But we have to ask ourselves, especially in the press, when we define this working class, how do we define that? Do we define it as white working class, or do we define it as everybody in the working class? White, black, Latino, Asian, Native American, all the different races that make that up. Because frankly, only one demographic of that working class went for Trump, and that's white people. A lot of black people who are suffering, frankly, in circumstances that are more dire than the white working class, opted for Hillary Clinton. Asians, Hillary Clinton. Latinos, Hillary Clinton. So we have to ask ourselves, what is it that is motivating those white working class, frankly, and I'll just say it, vote against their own interests? Because Donald Trump, if you look at what meager policy he actually did put forward, it's policy that is designed almost explicitly to hurt that same working class. And yet they excused that, they excused his misogyny, they excused his racism. In fact, they endorsed it because either it made them feel better, it made them feel more secure, more superior in a world that tells them that they're downtrodden and down on their luck, or perhaps they did it because they see the advances of people of color to be a threat to them. And I think that, if you look at Nicole Hannah-Jones's report in the New York Times, where she went back to her native Iowa, talking to Trump voters, and one woman mentioned that when President Obama mentioned that Trayvon Martin, had a son, would have looked just like him, that was seen by them as taking sides in this racial battle that we're engaged in. And so really, when you think about people's votes being decided upon that kind of flimsy logic, then it explains a lot.
Pramila, one of the interesting storylines was the state of Nevada. There were a lot of union workers, Hispanic hoteliers, food workers who organized get out the vote campaigns, and there was an assumption that there was going to be a big spike in Latino voting. Tell me about sort of where we go from here in that line of mobilizing, women of color, women of the working class.
One of the things that we hear a lot is that is the weakness of the labor movement at this particular moment. Only something like 6.7% of American workers in the private sector are in labor unions. But I think we need to broaden our definition of labor organizing beyond unions. And there's, in fact, a very vibrant labor movement in this country that includes hotel workers, that includes the Fight for 15 movement, that includes people who are organizing in places like worker centers that are outside the union structure. So there is, in fact, a very vibrant labor movement that I think has played a role in this election, that has worked to get voters out. And the hotel workers in Nevada is one example of that. But I think there is a kind of economic marginalization, a political disaffection that not only white male workers in the Midwest are experiencing, but workers all around the country are experiencing. And I think, Jamil, your point is absolutely right. The question is, why do some vote some way and some vote the other way? A lot of people didn't vote. A lot of people were so disaffected they didn't vote. But I think those white working class communities that did support Trump came to understand their poverty, their economic marginalization, their lack of progress in terms of others, right? In terms of the immigrants who were coming in terms of the fear of terrorism. And that was a strategy on the part of the right. It was a strategy to take this disaffection and to channel it into racist rhetoric, into blaming someone else, not the corporate world, but blaming somebody else for their position at this moment.
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple of things about that and just to look at the big picture again. And one is back to the media, a couple of things that are happening and have been happening that I think are so significant here. One is the business model of social media and media in general online, which is putting everything into buckets and creating apartheids between the left and the right, and between fake news and real news, meaning actually researched and fact-checked news as opposed to opinion disguised as news. And people are only reading and seeing what they want to. So it's very hard. It's been extremely hard and dismaying for anyone in the media to reach across those gaps. And feeding into that, and this goes back to my earlier comment about Reagan, is that there have, ever since Bill Clinton stepped up and upended Reaganomics, the Clintons have been targeted by the right because there are great believers, almost a religious belief in Reaganomics and trickle-down theory. And there's been a steady build-up of attacks and conspiracy theories and so on about the Clintons, which came to a height. And when you listen to people being interviewed, and women among them, white women among them, about why they didn't vote for Hillary, a lot of it was because they believed all those theories. And there's one other thing that I think the media is culpable for, which is that we tend to see people in categories, and we tend to assume that because a woman's a woman, of course she'd vote for a woman. But women identify with other things other than just being women, and they often identify with other things first, like which class they belong to, which race they belong to, who their neighbors are. If their neighbors are all white and they read nothing, and they read nothing but Breitbart and hear nothing but Fox, they're terrified of everybody they don't know, everybody. I live in the country part of the time. I'm surrounded by Trump people, and this is how they think. They're terrified of people they've never met because they only meet each other. They're all very isolated. And so white women are going to vote. Feminism hasn't penetrated to the point that feminism is the first identity for any woman.
I will just add to your remarks that as a member of the mainstream media, I was shocked by the amount of personal attacks that were sexist, racist, really vile. I was deleting things left and right, hoping my children wouldn't see. And everything from Asian slurs to researching my background and saying, oh, you're a Jew, that's why you posted that. So very personal attacks. And I think that right now the digital world is having a little bit of soul searching with regard to the fake news sites that are propagated offshore, literally in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. There are all these little fake news sites. And when Facebook changed their algorithm in August and got rid of human fact checkers, the algorithms pushed fake news sites higher. And now there's a sort of reckoning for what to do with those metrics and how to reorganize those metrics. Mark Zuckerberg is under a lot of fire because he came out during a tech conference and said, oh no, Facebook's not a media company, we're a tech company. When, in fact, Pew Research says that 50% of Americans now get their news from Facebook. So being able to discern, sort of fact from fiction online is very important. But Marianne, I wanted to pick up with you. We had talked a little bit about one of the turning points from a feminist perspective was when the Billy Bush tapes came out. And this whole idea that women of a certain age, I know that in the office I had young women come up to me and, the older women, we all gave each other knowing nods because we'd all been subjected to sexual harassment or abuse throughout our career, our decades-long career in my case. But the younger women hadn't really sensed it, and these stories started coming forward. And you wrote an article about sort of men talking about locker room talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was so shocking for so many of us, and the reason why I decided to do that article is because when those comments came out, and he literally said in his apology that it's just locker room talk or whatever it was, and I just said to myself, I mean, having worked I've got this initiative, Men and Women as Allies, that Feminist.com has with Michael Kimmel and the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities. I knew there were all these great groups that work to talk about this kind of toxic masculinization of men and that role in violence against women. So I had reached out to people like Tony Porter and Michael Kimmel and Don McPherson, all of these men that I knew would talk to this, because I didn't want two things: men and boys to think this was acceptable. This is just locker room talk. This is, something that is okay. And for women too, I think that was another point. I mean, we're talking about the ways in which feminism needs to change, and one of the things I think is so important is including men, not only as allies around feminist work for equality, but also looking at how the destructive gender stereotypes that negatively impact women negatively impact men and boys. And so for men and boys, I think if anything, this has to be, a sober looking at everything that's going on in society, and that being one of them. So I feel like part of it was, and now I'm concerned because, of course, the man who is this sexual predator who said all these things is president of the United States, and what that says, and of course this, traumatizing for women who have been victims of violence. And I think seeing all of the women who stepped up to share their experiences online, by the way, which is a positive thing in and of itself, because I think that's part of what we need to have happen. But also, I think we're going to really need to have, like, Joe Biden was such a positive. He took on campus sexual assault. That was one of his causes. If our leadership is anything other than that, we're going to have to be having these conversations, like, on a real, honest, grassroots level, men and women together.
So I saw an item on the way over here on my Twitter feed from Elle magazine, and it was pointing out the leading contender for the cabinet position of Agriculture Secretary had made a tweet. Did you see this? Yes. He had used the C word to describe Hillary Clinton, and he tweeted it out. And within moments, I don't know how long, but within a short period of time, his office took it, deleted it. And then they said that someone had hacked his account. And then they came up with another thought. No. Well, it was a retweet, and it was a careless error, and he would never want to offend anyone with that use. But the Elle magazine writer wrote, but it wasn't a retweet. That would be wrong, and yet, it's a fact check. And what I took what I took note of is that it's Elle magazine, right? A mainstream publication that I don't know would walk around saying we're a feminist, but they're speaking truth to power to a certain extent and keeping people on their toes, which I thought was heartening. Yes, let's look for points of awakening, and I'll leave it open for you. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, sorry. Go ahead.
Pramila, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, part of what's really scary about the misogyny and Trump's embrace of who he is as a person in terms of how he treats women is that it has really unleashed and given legitimacy to people all over this country to act like that. And my inbox is full of messages of people who have been harassed, who feel very comfortable expressing their misogyny, their hatred of women, and I think incidences of sexual harassment have gone up just in the past few days.
And so what do we do with that? Other than call it out and point it out, where do we as a society go forward?
Well, I think men in particular need to take the onus upon themselves to change our behavior. And I say our as in a collective. This is our problem to solve largely. We are the perpetrators of this sexual harassment, of this sexual abuse, of this rape culture. And we need to recognize that and hold each other accountable for it. Number one, I think the thing we need to do is stop trying to negotiate the allyship. What is it? What should I do? What should I not do? Do the work. Get involved. Get involved with organizations. I was in college. I was a rape crisis counselor. These are things that involve hearing the stories directly, getting involved with solving the problem. And then when you can, leave room for women to have their voice heard. Make room for them to have their voice heard. I think we need to start there. Understand that Trump, by deeming that as locker room talk, also insults men. Be insulted by that. We are not just roving sexual predators who are insatiable. We need to recognize that is an insult to us too.
Yes, actually, originally in the late 60s and early 70s, feminism did embrace men and made a very big political point about how important It was for men to be unchained from always having to be the breadwinner and never being able to express emotions and never being involved with their children and those other stereotypes that came up out of the 40s and 50s and before. That has largely been forgotten, and feminists are often accused of excluding men. And indeed, there has been an anger that I hear a lot among young women who do, and I hear a lot of anti-man speak, just as I hear a lot of this of sexist misogynist speak. I, for one, was not shocked at the language that Trump used. I was only shocked that a presidential candidate would talk like that, but I hear that kind of talk all around me all the time, which brings me to another point we haven't spoken about, which is the internalization of hatred. And we know by looking at the history of race in America and the history of Jews that internalizing hatred and prejudice is a real problem among those who are oppressed. And I would put to you that a lot of those 53% of white women who are willing to overlook the misogyny of Donald Trump were certainly voting along race lines, but they are also dismissing it as unimportant because they've accepted that women get treated like that and it's not supposed to matter. So I do think that's something men and women together can push back against by constantly doing articles, constantly talking, constantly getting out there about why it does matter and how it's actually healthier for everyone not to think of each other and ourselves that way.
Well, I was just going to say, you asked about awakening, because even though half the time I feel like crawling under the covers, I'm really trying to focus on what positives there are. First of all, it is that word awakening. We are all so woken up, I think, and a huge slap in the face to all of us. And I think that in and of itself is something that is an opportunity. I've seen things in this past week in terms of coalitions forming, and all of a sudden we're all sort of more unified. All of these groups and causes that sort of acted in silos, all of a sudden we're united behind what's right and justice and equality for all. So I think that is something that is healthy.
Can you describe the coalition for us? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think all of the groups that are going to be most under threat under Trump. So, women and LGBT and, African Americans and Muslims and people with disabilities and every marginalized group you can think of that's under threat. I've seen a sense of we're all united together. We're going to stick up, beyond those identities. I also think it's healthy to see that people who might have just voted and gone back to their lives, I've never seen so many citizens engaged and looking for ways to use their voices. And that's something that is a force, if harnessed, I think, correctly and with direction, is powerful. So those are the things that I see that are of hope. And I also think coming up with a narrative for girls and women that acknowledges all of this stuff we're talking about the misogyny and sexism, but she got farther than any other woman. And there are things to learn from her candidacy, and there are girls who I've been hearing who are now saying they might run for office. I think making sure that we take that and feed them positive encouragement and don't let them get beaten down and have a positive narrative to encourage them to pursue those leadership positions, because we're going to need women and all marginalized voices more than ever to step up and be leaders.
Yeah, I think a Trump presidency is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for a lot of people in this country, especially marginalized communities and the LGBTQ community, the Muslims, immigrants, the poor. I think we have to think about our political participation as not beginning and ending with the ballot. And that we have to speak out, we have to march in the streets, we have to do whatever we need to do. I think there's a walkout at Columbia University today at 3 o'clock.
Just saying.
But I think it's really, really important. This, for me, is not a time for us to be civil and polite and to compromise and to accept what he says. I think there is too much at stake for the most vulnerable among us, and I think it's a time for us to speak out.
Yeah, could I add to that? I was just going to say, thank you for that. I think it's time to get specific now.
Yes.
Because it's very easy to sit here and say we must do general things. There are many organizations that are already banding together to push back, and for whom you can volunteer. ACLU, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, tutoring immigrant children, providing homes for Muslims, providing escort services for women looking for coming into New York for abortions. There are many of them. A lot of them are popping up on my Facebook feed, and it's also important to keep pushing your senators and congresspeople, not just the Democrats, but the moderate Republicans. Keep calling them. Calling is more important than emailing. They get the calls. They don't really get the emails. Just call. You could all, every day, every morning, just make yourself call 3 people and say, you've got to push back against for the environment, or you've got to push back against disenfranchising African Americans, or whatever your issue is. I think we need to encourage the moderate Republicans in both houses to coalesce and with the Democrats and push back against the worst of Trump. So there are many concrete things you could be doing, and it will make you feel better. And I'm sure a lot of you have already thought of them, and we've got to reach across every gap between us and stop blaming us, all of each other too, and we'll just unite in this because we got to fight.
I just want to bring up a point, which is I'm a journalist, so I'm not an activist, and I'm not encouraging you to do anything untoward. But I will say I was moderating a panel at Room to Grow, which provides education and resources to pre-K children at risk. And the panelists all agreed that in this world now where, the Senate and the House is held by a Republican, the White House is held by a Republican, that legislative initiatives will have a harder slog, obviously, unless they have the imprimatur of what Room to Grow was suggesting, which is a metrics-based, independent, proven initiative that can then be brought to Washington for funding that sort of flies under the partisan sniping. And the way they were sort of constructing these coalitions sort of under the fray was a very sort of, I thought, strategically interesting. And also, as I was scrolling through Elle magazine, as you were too apparently, there was a movement to donate. Again, I'm not advocating this, but I just am pointing it out, that there was a movement to donate to Planned Parenthood in Mike Pence's name. I'm not advocating it, I'm just pointing it out.
I mean, I'll advocate it. But one thing I want to speak to is also, like, it is time to get specific about, what work you need to do. And that doesn't necessarily just mean volunteering or donating to these organizations. It means having conversations starting next week at the dinner table with a lot of people, you have family members who voted for Trump, who hold these beliefs. Have the conversations with them. Do not shy away from that, because that is the front on which, I know it's gonna suck.
Pass the cranberry sauce.
But I'm not saying, look, this is not something I'm used to doing. I go, in my family, we don't necessarily have to have these conversations. We pretty much all agree. But so I'm not underscoring how, I'm not trying to, lessen how hard that's going to be. But it needs to be done. I mean, these are the conversations that need to be had. If you talk to your parents or your grandparents about transgender rights, or why abortion access is a real problem, it's going to become an increasingly more difficult problem under Trump. All the different fronts that we've been fighting for, with these liberal priorities, feminism, anti-racism, all of them are in jeopardy now. All of them. So I think first thing, protection, and start having these conversations.
I completely agree with that. And, I'll just say again, I think citizen participation is about having those discussions, about disagreement, about debate. It's not about simply politely agreeing with somebody when you really don't. I'm a historian, and I look at social change and social movements. And at every moment in history that we think of as a turning point, changes were not made because somebody was elected to office. Okay, when we look at the Civil War and slave emancipation, slaves were not freed in this country because Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. They were freed because of an abolitionist movement that was 2 decades long. They were freed because slaves themselves, as a number of historians have argued, used the disruptions of civil war to free themselves. The civil rights movement victories were not because of Lyndon Johnson or because of Martin Luther King. It was because thousands, tens of thousands of people marched in the streets and dozens of people gave their lives. The politicians who were in office were not on the left, so to speak, true of Franklin Roosevelt as well, but it's because people pushed them in a particular direction and they made their voice heard. So I think this is a moment when we can collectively speak out and we can collectively push our politicians in the right direction.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything everybody said, including what Jamil said, which I think is really going to be important and hard to try to understand, I think for right now, if there's anything, it is about trying to have, trying to understand where people are coming from, really having those honest conversations, because I still don't really understand. So I think that we're going to need to have those conversations, and also I think in the lens of protest, because everybody is still very emotional and angry right now, and that is so natural, but also trying to find ways to find out not just what we're protesting against, but what do we stand for? What's the positive vision that we have? And also, in all of the different ways that we're gonna activate and mobilize, also just like self-care, first of all, because this is really a stressful time, but also just small acts of kindness, or even the little things. If someone says something racist or sexist, say something. So I think we're all just gonna have to find our own way. There's not gonna be one way that, that everybody can do, but I think more than ever, we should just take this as an opportunity to sort of, wake up and hold a positive vision for the world that we do wanna have.
I want to address the journalists in the room, which I assume there are quite a few. But I think actually they're more than journalists in training already, at least my students are, which is how to infuse your reporting with feminism at the moment, and also where to go as reporters. I know that not everybody likes to hear this, but I kind of see you on the front lines here. I think journalism has never been more important. So I would really encourage you not to continue to cover those marginalized people and how they're being made to suffer and what exactly they're going through under the new policies that might come through, but also to go to the people who voted for Trump and all over the country and keep asking them, what did you want from this election? What did you expect to get? What did you need? Are you getting it? And to keep asking that question through the next 4 years, because there are going to be a lot of disappointed people out there. And I've seen people change their minds against Trump when they didn't, against Bush, when they didn't get what they thought they'd get. So we need to keep our finger on that pulse and always through it thinking about how it impacts women, how it impacts the disenfranchised groups we've listed several times already, and how you can incorporate everyone into the conversation, so you don't just interview, an African American about being African American or a queer person about being queer. You also interview them for their expertise and their authority, and the same with women, to make all your reporting multicultural, and that's part of feminism too.
Pramila, I want to spend a little bit of time expanding on sort of the different levers of feminism that could be pulled going forward, right? You talked about this sort of corporate feminism of breaking the glass ceiling. Then we touched a little bit about reproductive rights, but they're often marginalized as women's issues. How do we push feminism forward, those issues that are dear to women, but also to society? Because we know that, mainstreaming feminism, is clearly the direction that you want to head.
Well, when I look at the labor movement today, as I mentioned, I think there are a lot of women who are at the forefront of campaigns like the Fight for 15 movement, who are at the forefront of expanding.
Expand on the Fight for 15 a little bit.
So the Fight for 15 movement includes low-wage workers from different industries, from the fast food industry, from the home health care industry, taxi workers, I mean, a whole range of workers from different sectors who have come together to fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And it's for the basic reason that it's very difficult to earn a living wage with less than $15. If you think about the cost of housing in a place like New York City, the cost of childcare, the cost of transportation, it's just it's impossible for anyone to earn less than $15 an hour, and it's even hard at $15 an hour to survive and to support a family. And so I think one of the key questions we have to ask is, if somebody is in fact working full time, why is it that they are not earning enough to support themselves and their families? And that's a question that I think feminism has to confront, right? If we, and we're talking about a lot of women who are taking care of their families. We could also talk about welfare assistance, and people don't like to talk about welfare. You know, there was a lot of discussion in the campaign about the working class, about the middle class, no discussion about the poor. But in fact, there are people who cannot work. There are people who need to stay home and take care of their children. There are people who have checkered work histories. And I think we have to begin to talk about some kind of safety net for the poorest of the poor. We have an exploding homeless population in this country. We have many, many people on food stamps, but we don't really have any kind of real safety net, in part because of the Clintons, because welfare was dismantled under Bill Clinton in 1996, and Hillary Clinton, I'm sad to say, despite her claims to be a feminist, was a champion of welfare reform, and even as late as being, you know, when she was a senator, called for more punitive welfare policies. But I really do think, I mean, we don't need to institute the old system, but we have to begin to think about how we can provide economic support for the most neediest.
I just want to warn everyone that in a minute or two, I'm going to ask you all for your very brilliant questions. So get those ready. Jamil, did you have a thought?
No, just, I mean, of course, I write a lot about identity politics. And so I think really, if you're having trouble finding out where to start with this, where to begin, start with identifying. Start with acknowledging what you identify as. I identify as a feminist. I identify as a black man. I identify with all the different things that, either are cast upon me by the, accident of birth or things that I choose. And so I think that, if you want to look for a point to start there. And just diversify your media diet. Really, you are what you take in, and not just with food, but also with media. Think about what you're bringing in on a daily basis into your line of thinking.
My last question before we open up to the audience is one of sexual politics. I mean, what was interesting in the, body shaming, the casual misogyny, the references to sexual abuse, that there was a real awakening, if you will. There was a female writer who wrote about her own sexual assault, and it went viral, and millions of women started sharing their stories. And it became, at least in my office, something that everyone talked about, and everyone shared stories. And that, to me, was a little bit of an awakening. Tell me about if you felt that as well, or if you saw that as a result of this election cycle.
Well, it's always been there. I mean, I remember the rape speak-outs. It was before my time, but I remember reading about them in the 60s, which is when women first started talking in public about sexual assault, and then Take Back the Night was started. It was the first kind of, we are not going to be ashamed and silent. And I know through my own research, that that 1 in 6 women, if not more, is sexually assaulted in her lifetime. So this is something that is so common among us. And I think this was less an awakening than a license, a kind of pulling together a camaraderie and opening up of a chance on social media to pour this stuff out. I mean, the amount of domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women in this country. The amount of violence that we have to put up with, verbally and physically, in our lives is so unacceptable, there's hardly a word for it. We should be so angry about it all the time. And so should men, and a lot of us are. So I think it was great that there was this window of a moment when it was all out there, and it probably did wake some people up who didn't know about it. But I think mostly it was just an explosion of what we already knew.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm glad some of these things in some ways are coming to light. I mean, last week I went to cover the premiere of Eve Ensler's film City of Joy, and just hearing what happens to the women and girls, you know, in the Congo who are just atrocities and rapes, you know, as weapons of war. I mean, this is something that's happening on a global scale, this kind of mass violence against women, objectification of women, and it's something I hope that we will take the opportunity to really reflect on, because it's tied into even the media, the sexualization of girls and women and in the media, and the fixation on, you know, women's looks and bodies. So it's a symptom of a sickness, you know, that we have to look at, and again, in that sober way of why is that happening? I think just like we're talking about not demonizing others, I think we have to look at why men are perpetuating these crimes. What is it about the culture? And so I think it is an opportunity for a really important conversation, and it is tied into the way that, you know, women are not really valued as human beings in a lot of ways.
Right, when you have a presidential candidate who admits that he walked in on teenage girls that were partially naked, and obviously we know what was said in the Billy Bush tapes. Question in the back. Oh, in the front. Do you want to go to the microphone? Yeah. Do you mind going to the microphone? That'd be great. Just identify yourself, if you don't mind. Tell us what part of Columbia life you're from. And then feel free to, we're going to ask 3 questions, and then we're going to do a scattershot answer. Go ahead.
Okay, it's not necessarily a question. It's first, thank you very much, and thank you for everybody coming out here. It's more of a comment. As far as one of the concerns I have is when we start to talk about Hillary versus Trump, and I think one of the things we should change is just those one individuals. We should change the pronouns. We should change the nouns. So it's not them, it's we. We let that happen. They represent the zenith of what has occurred so far, where the country is heading. So I think, as what you had mentioned earlier, it wasn't just necessarily Abraham Lincoln that changed a part of history. It was the movement, it was the mobilization. And I think that's what we should be doing. So instead of just saying, it's Trump, it's Hillary, it's actually us. We let this happen, now we have to change it. And even when we talk about Hillary's emails, we let her get away with that. Trump walked in on the women. We let them get away with that. So now we just have to really bond together, band together, and make a movement together. And so what I'm trying to do right now is align myself with leaders. So if anybody really wants to reach out to me or really wants to get together, I want to meet you. So it's mn2427 at Columbia. So please reach out to me, email me. But basically, thank you again. And one more thing is, when I was coming over here, someone said, well, what do you want to change? Because I've been going to the rallies, I've been going to the marches. I'm just a little dot in a crowd. I don't want to change. I want to protect, I want to preserve, I want to keep this country where we are as far as the democracy and the integrity and the morals, and move forward with that. So that's what I have to say.
Okay, we have 2 more questions.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Hadia Shirazi, and I'm an international student here at Columbia, and I'm studying sustainability, climate change, and my area of interest is really gender and peace and security. And as of Tuesday, I really questioned a lot of my life choices so far. And I got back from DC Tuesday morning at 3 a.m. In addition to organizing like a massive conference at the World Bank for young people from around the world, I ended up having a lot of meetings with women who are political appointees in this administration. And I had a lot of things to think about. And you talked about being specific, so here's a question. This summer I had an experience on the subway where I was attacked by a man, and that kind of prompted me to think, like, how do we make it possible for women and girls to feel safe on the subway, and in general when they're on public transportation, not just in New York City, but in the United States? Because for you to be able to get to where you need to be able to do that safely. So I started working on this proposal, looking at research, and then I thought, and everyone said, you know what, wait till after the election, because everyone's kind of preoccupied right now, and this is great, and it's, you know, people are going to be interested. So now I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at all these other projects that I have. Do I just put them away? Because I stood there looking at Capitol Hill and thinking, that's probably going to be a no. The White House will probably be a no. So who is going to listen to people like me and to ideas like these? And where do I go? Where do we go?
All right, that's excellent question. Next.
Hi there. My name is Megan. I work for the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy in a student-facing role. And so I think of my job as I have an educational role, personally and professionally. And the number one criticism I've gotten from people throughout my network is that my rhetoric isn't accessible, and I feel like I don't know how to talk to people. I don't even know where to begin to talk to people because, as has been mentioned, these ideas are extremely complex and they've built up over generations. And I don't know how to approach my Thanksgiving dinner table without stepping my family through, feminist theory 101 through the PhD level. So I take a lot of my cues from media, like the media you produce. How do you plan to adjust your rhetoric to reach a broader audience, and do you have recommendations for the ways we can do that in our personal and professional lives?
That's 3 comments, but let me take one more question quickly. Go ahead, yeah. And then we'll go through 3 more after we answer them.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I'm Nora. I'm a PhD student in the political science department at Columbia. And my question is, I'm an international student, so for non-Americans, how do we approach this? Like, we don't have senators, so how do we organize? How do we respond to people who dismiss you because they say this is not your country? So how do we act? Thank you.
Oh boy. Yeah.
Well, I'll start by saying this is your country. If you're here, this is your country. You have every right to call a New York State senator, U.S. senator, any person that's elected to an office that's governing the area where you live, where you stand. Okay? So if you're from here, if you're not, I'd hate to think that just because I'm not from New York, I wouldn't be able to call somebody about concerns that deal with New York. Number 2 is, I think one thing we really need to guard against is false equivalence. We need to, there's a lot of like Hillary's emails, Donald Trump's misogyny. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not the same thing. Hillary saying super predators, Donald Trump calling for the death of the Central Park Five and continuing to say that they are guilty and endorsing policy that makes that mainstream. This is how this stuff becomes normal. When you compare things that are utterly extreme to things that, yes, are problems, but are not anywhere close. It ain't even the same ballpark, okay? When you start doing that, that is how this stuff becomes normalized. We see Steve Bannon, who has been appointed as White House chief strategist, the head of Breitbart, basically a hub for white nationalism on the web, and alleged anti-Semite, and everybody's just like, oh, he's got controversial opinions. He's made some racialized remarks. No. Call it out. It doesn't matter if you're offending people when you call it out. Speak the truth, because who else is going to do it? Who else is going to do it?
Yeah, let's not forget that 26% of the whole country voted for Trump. That's only a smidgen over a quarter. The rest either didn't vote or didn't vote for him. So didn't vote at all or didn't vote for him. So I don't think we need to feel like there's nobody going to listen to us at all. There are many groups pulling together who are already declaring that they're going to continue to do their work regardless of what happens on Capitol Hill. So for the question about who do I talk to when I want to be safe on the subway, there are lots of other ways and other organizations that could be behind you there, if you do some research. As for how to talk to your family, I would take a note from storytellers. So you don't begin with theory, you just begin with, how would you feel if you went to the supermarket and they wouldn't serve you because they didn't like your hat, or they called you horrible names because they didn't like your rings or whatever, and try and put people in other people's shoes through something that they know about themselves. You tell stories. Theory is a hard way to reach people, so I hope that helps. But I think, it's not like all all organizations that care about protecting people have to be okayed by Capitol Hill?
I would just say I think we can think about how we can make small changes. And in the face of Donald Trump, it doesn't seem like small changes would matter, but I think they do matter. And I think if you look, I study social movements, as I've told you. I think when you look at those periods in between, the 1930s and the Civil Rights Movement, there were lots of people who were organizing on a small scale, making very small changes that led up to a big, massive movement. So I think small changes. I mean, here at Columbia, I know there are people who are advocating creating a sanctuary for undocumented students here at Columbia. That's a small movement that we can, have some influence on here at Columbia. And I think that it's really, really important to stay true to your values and your beliefs, whatever those are, and to not give in to the face of people who are very difficult to talk to. There might be some people not worth talking to, quite honestly, maybe even some family members. And I would say don't stress yourself out and don't waste your energy if you're not going to get anywhere with them. But I think having the conversations and I think creating whatever small changes we can where we are is very, very important.
Well, I guess I would just say it's only been a little over a week, and I think it's okay that we don't really quite know what we need to do yet. I think we have to give ourselves time to process it, and I know I'm still processing, I'm still healing, I'm still in shock, I'm still in mourning. So I think that let's not feel the pressure that right now we know exactly what are going to be the mechanisms to produce change. I can tell you, just even as somebody who is a activist, there are amazing meetings and webinars and things that are going on that I think will produce some interesting coalitions and opportunities for more organized ways of using our voices. But in the meanwhile, I just think having those conversations is very important, but also I want to make sure that even though we're going to be fighting against a lot of things, if there are efforts, whether it's working to, have women feel safer on the subway, we're going to need to keep moving forward even beyond just protesting against. Whatever we were doing before, wherever you're feeling pulled to use your voices and take action, that is still going to be more important than ever. And just starting with what feels true to you and having conversations, forming groups and coalitions, but also, as I said, let's all realize it's okay that we don't know exactly now. I think let's give ourselves a little self-love. It will definitely have to unfold.
We're going to ask a second round of questions, but just to throw some thoughts in there for you. For the woman who wants to do the protecting on the subway, that is the perfect example of something that you could take the metrics, you could take the research, you could get funding, whether it's nonprofits or, city or whatever it is, and try to go viral with it and try to make it a social movement, right? Yeah. And I think it's a very small but targeted way of doing precisely that. The other thing I would say to the woman whose Thanksgiving dinner is filled with anxiety, a couple of things. One, Peter Thiel, the billionaire software guy who's gay and who is a big Trump supporter, said something very, I thought, intelligent after the results came in. And he said, the media took Trump literally, but not seriously. And yet the voters took Trump seriously, but not literally. And I think that if we look across the line and look at people who supported Trump, they're not all this boogeyman that is being painted as racist and xenophobic and horrible. They have real grievances. And the other thing I would say is that my colleague, Terry Moran, who covered a lot of politics for 35 years and did it, in a masterful way, said to me after the election results, he said 50% of the electorate felt disenfranchised for whatever reasons. You may not agree with their grievance. They might not even have the right perception of their grievance. They might not even have the right path out. But now, after this result, those disenfranchised people will be heard, whether it's the Democratic Party listening to them, whether it's the reconstituted Republican Party. And he said, Juju, we can't move forward unless the entire Republic is heard and stands united in some way. That's a very sort of optimistic view of it, and I think that's one way of looking at the members of your family, the people in our community, the 50% in the electorate who voted for this man. But we're waiting for 3 questions, so I was stalling, waiting for people. Come on in.
Yes.
Each day brings a new surprise. I understand that Sarah Palin's now being considered for Secretary of the Interior. I have a really simple question. I haven't had a clear understanding of the reason for Hillary Clinton's defeat. There are many theories, but my question is, how much of it was misogyny, pure and simple, keeping in mind that Oscar Wilde said things are never pure and rarely simple?
Great question. Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name is Saskia Shenwan, and I'm part of the business school here. And Professor Benedict, I think, you mentioned how people need, especially in the journalism school, and I used to work as a producer at PBS, how you have to keep your pulse on the finger of the disenfranchised. But I think something from having worked at PBS and also now being in the business school that I've realized is that monetization is something that's really important. And often stories about the disenfranchised, except for this election where people wanted to hear the outlandish quotes and wanted to highlight that kind of stuff, they don't really get reported on because it's not bringing the clicks, it's not bringing the viewers, especially in television. So I guess how do we make the wider population more interested in that kind of thing, and how can we really talk to corporate kind of backing to say that these stories are important and they are educating people and they are eventually going to bring in a new audience or something like that? And that's for everyone, but you talked about it.
Hi, my name is Lorena Mitchell. I'm a student at the School of Social Work here. And thank you for the great panel. I really appreciate your point about open, honest conversations. I'm a future social worker. I believe in dialogue. But I also know that there are certain conversations where we come to an impasse. I think particularly about my work in reproductive rights. And I've had very open, honest conversations about abortion, but I never convinced anyone who was anti-choice, and they never convinced me. And there are a lot of issues. It's not just abortion. There are a lot of issues that I think the two sides will never convince each other. And I just wonder what your thought is when we come to those impasses.
Such a great question. Thank you. Next. Was that three?
That was three.
Okay. Sorry. That was three. I'm very bad at math, evidently. We have about 10 minutes, so go ahead and go for it.
Okay, I'm going to put about the misogyny question. Of course, that was a huge part of it. Of course, I think. But as I said before, we can't. It's not really realistic to slot things into just one box at a time. So class, resentment, racism, misogyny, they're all mixed up together in this country. And class especially, which I come from a country where we don't know anything about racism, but we know a lot about class in England. We're really bad at the history of racism. But class we get, and whereas here it's almost the other way around. And they're intertwined inextricably, I think. So the answer is both, is yes, but there's more. The question about PBS, this is a perennial problem for journalism always. You know, how do you get the corporations who are the owners of the media who just want to make money to let you do stories about people who are not popular to read about, i.e. the poor and disenfranchised and so on? Reporters constantly have this challenge. And all you can do is tell the stories in the most compelling way with the most human interest so that they grab people anyway. I think some of the newer media organizations like BuzzFeed are much better at this than some of the older ones. BuzzFeed is read by the right and the left. It's way ahead often of other organizations, and it's not the only online journalism online magazine like this. But they've got their finger on the pulse of different generations, younger people more, and they're pretty good at getting surprising stories about people you would think no one would want to read about to go viral, because they figured out more how to do it than a lot of the older ones have. So, but it's always difficult. So, I mean, we constantly talk about this with my students. How do you make your story, you know, about a homeless person who's being kicked out of his shanty interesting to everybody. You know, how do you make it so electric people can't avoid it? And it's a challenge, but it's not impossible, and it happens. But part of what I'm saying is we have to push for that more, we have to really, really push.
Yeah. I think one of the more predictive books when it comes to this election, like that saw what was coming. It's a book called Reality Bites Back, ironically, by Jennifer Posner, who's a media critic. And she analyzes reality television and the misogyny and the racism and all of the other isms that are embedded into our entertainment. And so I think that what we need to do with regards to your question is fight for and push for programming and coverage that eliminates or at least starts to draw some of that out of our own entertainment. Don't support programs that, are inherently sexist. Programs like The Bachelor and Bachelorette. Sorry if there are fans in the room, but sorry, it is. The Apprentice was incredibly racist in a lot of ways, and sexist. And so we need to make sure that we support programming that feeds the ideals that we support. That also goes for cable news. And I have a bit of a personal stake in this, having been a producer for Rachel Maddow and for Melissa Harris Perry. You saw in this campaign cycle a noticeable pullback from programming that reflected intersectional perspectives. It just did. You saw a lot more straight politics, a lot more of this sort of crossfire style of coverage on CNN, MSNBC, and presumably Fox too. I don't watch it. And really, that I think was to our detriment as an electorate.
I will just address the question of misogyny. In the election, I think, I read somewhere online, and I'm sorry I can't attribute it to the author, but who said that, if you think about Trump, somebody who was completely unprepared for his first debate, who had 5 children by 3 different women, who had absolutely no political experience at all, could be elected for president. Would we hold a woman to that? Or, obviously we hold women to a much, much higher standard. If he had been a woman, there is no way he would have been in office right now, or he will be in office. The question about, the impasse and how do we change people's minds when they seem so entrenched in their beliefs. I think it's amazing to think about how ideas change over time. There was a time in this country when white Southerners couldn't imagine sitting next to black people in a restaurant or in a school, right? And they were very entrenched in their ideas. But people's ideas do change. It happens slowly. It happens through lots of conversations. It happens through organizing. But their ideas do change. So I would just say have hope.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that she just said in terms of there was this crazy false equivalence between, someone like Trump against, a presidential candidate like Hillary Clinton, who was even Barack Obama said that she would be the most prepared, qualified president in history. So I think there will have to be a lot of unpacking of it, and certainly, as I said, there was a lot of sexist coverage and rhetoric, and even just what was being exemplified by his comments and behavior around women. So there's just no question that this was a sort of misogynist backlash. Regarding the media, I can't remember the exact figure. Was it that the media gave Donald Trump, was it like $2 billion free of airtime? I think just as much as we have to get money out of politics, we do have to get money out of the media. And I know even when I was doing interviews for my book, that's why we need all of you to be in the media, and also even in executive positions. I think the number is that only 5% of clout positions in the media are held by women. We need diversity and women in the media at all levels, not just as journalists. And I do think that to the point of speaking out against racist, sexist coverage, as well as supporting positive forms of media, is important. And then I also agree on having conversations. This is a time, whether it is on this, sort of whole issue of reproductive choice, I think the more that we can try to have those type of conversations is absolutely essential now to try to just raise these things and try to understand on the other side why people feel that way and have those open conversations without judgment and trying to make sure that we advocate for what we know is right.
I have a couple thoughts. One, on the misogyny question, there's some social researchers that looked at polling about Hillary Clinton longitudinally. And every time she was stable in a position of power, whether it was First Lady or in the Senate or in the State Department, her popularity was quite high. But each time she sought power, her approval ratings would drop. And it tells you a little something about sort of perception of women seeking power. The other stat I would point out to you is this idea of people's minds changing. And if you look at the electorate and slice across the age of 45, across every, race, gender, every other demographic, if you cross at 45, there's a 20-point advantage for Trump above 45 and a 26 spread below. So there is a sense that, yes, the millennials didn't turn out. Yes, there was depressed voting in various pockets. But if you just look at progressive thoughts over time, it's kind of fascinating. And in terms of your question about media and good storytelling, I work at Nightline. I would encourage you all to watch it, DVR it, follow us on Facebook. But in the last calendar year, I've been to Chad, Cameroon, and Nigeria following Boko Haram. I just got back from Honduras doing a story, the hook of which is it's the most dangerous place in the world to be a woman, because we examined sexual politics, sexual violence, domestic violence, and drug warfare. And you'll remember a couple years back all the migration of unaccompanied minors fleeing the violence there. So each time we do that, and I just, to toot my own horn, won some awards for a piece I did about mass incarceration and children visiting their mothers behind bars and fathers behind bars. And each time we are allowed to do these stories and they are seen as successful, not because I've pitched a story about disenfranchised folks, but because I've pitched a story about a human being that we can all relate to, and that there is some visceral understanding that these women that I'm following in Honduras are women just like us, or this child visiting their parent behind bars is a child just like any child we know. And so finding that universality, finding that connection that your audience might be able to have with somebody who's disenfranchised is, I would think, the key to unlocking a lot of these stories. But it's hard. It's a very hostile environment out there, for sure, against journalists.
That's exactly, what I was driving at with making the story so electric and bringing out the human interest. But I just want to point out one thing. If we're interested in advancing women in politics or in careers, it comes back to reproductive rights and family leave policies. So we're not going to get very far on those from Capitol Hill, it looks like. But you can get together with your or sister, I should say, employees at your places of work and agitate for fairer treatment so that you are not penalized in your careers by the lack of access to childcare or to reproductive, health. And that's really something we can all do on grassroots in our own workplaces.
I think you got the spirit of where I was going last, which is wrap. Give us your closing thoughts, and then we'll say goodbye. Thank you guys so much for having us.
Local and state activism. Of course, if, say, Roe v. Wade is overturned, make sure the time to get involved in pressuring state and local lawmakers to make sure that these rights that we've earned, that we fought for, are protected. The time to start fighting for that is now.
Two quick things. One is that many of the issues that have been raised in this campaign are not new. The questions of sexual harassment, of racism. But this is a moment. It is a moment when people are awakened, so we can begin to talk about that. And I would also just say part of building a different kind of society is premised on love and compassion. So as you move forward and think about how you're going to engage, keep love and compassion at the center of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a time where just your voice matters, especially young people. I feel like this is, help us build the world that we all want to see and find your own way to make change. And just because of the nature of my book, I always like to remind you all, if to consider running for office, we're going to need as many people as we can of conscience, in the system now, and certainly in the media. Just whatever way, even in your small daily life choices that you can contribute to making that world that you want to see, they are all meaningful. So just find your way, but use your voice.
Do you have another closing thought or an additional summation, and then we'll say goodbye?
All right, no, okay.
Really get a fair shot at it.
I've been watching Good Girls Revolt, and my daughter made me watch it. And you know, it's a real reminder of what a lot of women have had to go through for fairness in the workplace. In terms of coming to politics, I read an article recently that one of the reasons we don't have more women in politics is because they never even try in the first place, because there isn't enough encouragement. I think, you know, one of the things that works against women is that we've been taught so much to be polite and so much not to ruffle feathers. And I think this is the point where we just have to start. We break down the barriers and we ask each other, what do you earn? How much maternity leave are you getting? How long have you waited for a promotion? What did they ask you when they hired you? And this is across all ethnic groups. This is for everybody. And then you talk to each other and you mass together, and maybe you'll have to do it legally or maybe not. Very often it just takes a culture going to the boss and saying, you know, we've just discovered that we're all earning $10,000 a year less than our male counterparts. So I do think that kind of thing can start right away.
And the last thing I'll say is social media is a platform. So I would encourage you to engage to the extent that you're a future journalist, to the extent that you're concerned citizens. It's a good way of getting information. It's a good way of sharing information. And, you know, we'll just get rid of all the fake news out there. Thank you so much. And I'm at Juju Chang ABC if you're interested.
Thank you again to all of our guests. It was a terrific conversation, and we in the Office of University Life like to keep the conversations going. So please share your thoughts on Facebook or submit them to us online. Also, our next event is on November 29th. It will be a community conversation about free speech in our community. Thank you all again.